Clara's boots crunched over broken glass as she pushed through the rotted door of the Valley Library. 17 years old and carrying everything she owned in a canvas pack that smelled like smoke. The building stood alone at the base of the ridge, 3 stories of stone and peeling paint that the valley had abandoned 8 years ago when the road washed out. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one was supposed to be here. But the evacuation camps in the lowlands felt like cages. And she couldn't breathe there anymore, not after what she'd seen. Not after watching her entire village slide into the gorge 3 weeks ago while she was gathering herbs 2 miles away. The interior was colder than the November air outside. Dust hung in shafts of grey light filtering through windows covered in grime and bird nests. Shelves stood in crooked rows, their spines warped by moisture. Books scattered across the floor like discarded thoughts. The circulation desk was buried under years of leaves blown in through cracks in the walls. Water damage bloomed across the ceiling in dark constellations. This place had died slowly, she thought, not all at once like her home. Clara set her pack down carefully, wincing at the sharp pain in her left shoulder, the one that still seized up whenever she moved too quickly. A reflex from throwing herself against a tree when the ground started shaking. She hadn't told the camp doctors about it. Hadn't told them about waking up gasping every night, or the way her hands trembled whenever she heard thunder, or how she couldn't look at moving earth without her vision tunneling. They'd keep her there longer. They'd ask questions she didn't have answers for. She pulled out her grandmother's journal from the pack's inner pocket, its leather cover cracked and soft from decades of handling. It was the only thing she'd grabbed from her house before they bulldozed the wreckage. Her grandmother had been a weather watcher, a keeper of patterns, someone the old-timers trusted more than the government meteorologists. The journal was filled with observations, warnings, drawings of cloud formations and water levels. Clara didn't know why she'd taken it. Didn't know what good weather patterns would do when the entire mountainside could just collapse. A sound stopped her, sharp and sudden from somewhere in the building's depths. A crack, then a groan of settling wood. Clara's breath caught, her body going rigid. Her right hand shot to the knife at her belt before she could think. Just the building, she told herself. Just old bones settling. But her heart hammered against her ribs, and she couldn't make her fingers let go of the knife handle. She forced herself to breathe, to move. The front section was too exposed, too open to the elements. She needed shelter deeper inside, somewhere the wind couldn't reach. As she walked past, the children's section chairs shaped like mushrooms now split and molding, she noticed a door behind the reference desk, slightly ajar. Employee area. Maybe. Storage. That's when she felt it, a vibration through the floor. Subtle. Wrong. Then, the entire northwest corner of the ceiling caved in with a roar that threw her back against a bookshelf. Plaster, beams, and decades of compressed debris crashed down where she'd been standing 30 seconds earlier. Dust exploded through the room in a choking cloud. Clara's ears rang, her shoulders screamed, and through the new hole in the ceiling, she could see the dark sky and smell the coming storm. The building wasn't stable. Of course it wasn't stable. Nothing in this valley was stable anymore. She grabbed her pack with shaking hands and ran for the door behind the desk. The back room was narrow and darker than the main floor, lit only by one small window filmed with grime. Clara dragged a filing cabinet against the door she'd come through, her breath coming in shallow gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. Dust covered her face, her clothes caught in her throat. She couldn't stop seeing the ceiling coming down, couldn't stop calculating how close she'd been to being buried again. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she tried to light the camping stove she'd brought. The striker slipped twice, 3 times. She cursed, tears of frustration burning her eyes. Such a simple thing. Flick the striker, light the flame, boil water for the instant soup packets she'd taken from the camp supplies. But her fingers felt disconnected, clumsy. The fourth attempt produced a weak flame that guttered out immediately. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." On the seventh try, it caught. She sat back hard against the wall, staring at the small blue flame like it was a miracle. This was supposed to be easier. She was supposed to be capable. Her grandmother had taught her to survive alone in the mountains for weeks at a time, raiding weather and finding water and building shelters that could withstand anything. But that was before the ground betrayed her. Before she learned that all the knowledge in the world couldn't save you if the earth itself decided to move. The water took forever to boil. While she waited, Clara opened her grandmother's journal, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting. There were entries about the winter of '98, when the valley flooded, notes about the dry season of 2003, sketches of the ridge line with measurements and elevations marked in careful numbers. Her grandmother had known this land like she knew her own heartbeat. "The mountain remembers," one entry read. "Water doesn't forget where it's been. Watch the seeps. Watch the trees." Clara closed the journal carefully, tucking it back into her jacket. What good was watching when everything could vanish in 90 seconds? The soup was thin and tasted like salt and failure, but she drank it anyway, forcing herself to swallow. She tried to patch the window with a plastic tarp from her pack, but the frame was too damaged, the wood too rotten to hold tacks. Wind whistled through the gaps. She tried to organize her supplies, sleeping bag, extra clothes, the first aid kit. She didn't know how to use properly, but her mind kept drifting, kept replaying the sound of her neighbors screaming as their houses tilted and fell. By the time night settled over the valley, she'd managed to make the room marginally warmer and marginally less terrifying. She was rolling out her sleeping bag when she noticed it, a seam in the wall behind a shelf of moldering reference books. Not a cracker doorframe painted over, but visible where the paint had peeled. Clara pulled the shelf away slowly, and it came easier than she expected, revealing a narrow door with a brass handle, tarnished black with age. Her pulse quickened. She turned the handle. The door opened onto a staircase leading down into darkness, stone steps disappearing into what must have been the library's basement. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of earth and old paper and something else, something dry and preserved. She grabbed her flashlight, checked the battery, and descended. The basement was larger than the room above, stretching under most of the building's footprint. But it wasn't a typical storage area. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with archive boxes, filing cabinets, and glass display cases covered in dust. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden table, and spread across its surface were maps, journals, and leather-bound volumes carefully weighted down with stones to keep them flat. Clara approached slowly, sweeping her flashlight across the table. These weren't library books, they were records, official documents, and in the center, marked with a red ribbon, was a manuscript labeled in faded ink, Geological Survey of the Northern Valley Region, confidential -1967 to 2004. She opened it with trembling fingers. The first page was a warning letter, signed by 3 geologists, dated 2004. This valley is not suitable for permanent settlement. Subsurface water flow has compromised slope stability across 17 identified zones. Recommend immediate evacuation and monitoring protocols. 21 years ago, they'd known. Before she could read further, she heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but deeper, a rumble that came from the earth itself. The flashlight flickered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. Then the walls started to crack. Clara grabbed the manuscript and 2 of the leather journals, shoving them into a pack as the rumbling intensified. The display case at the far end shattered, glass exploding across the floor. She ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, her shoulders screaming in protest. Behind her, she heard the groan of settling stone, the crack of breaking timber. She made it back to the room just as the basement door slammed shut on its own, the building's frame talking with the pressure. The camping stove had tipped over, spilling water across her supplies. Wind roared through the broken window, and outside, through the grimy glass, she could see the sky had turned the color of a bruise. The storm was here, hours early, just like the landslide had come hours before the warning said it would. Clara spread the manuscript across the floor with shaking hands, using her flashlight to read by the dying daylight. Page after page of geological surveys, water table measurements, slope angle calculations, maps with red zones marked across the entire valley. The geologists had identified 17 critical areas. Her village had been built directly on top of Zone 4. And, according to the maps, the library sat at the convergence of Zones 8, 9, and 10. She flipped frantically through the pages, finding handwritten notes in the margins. Eastern ridge shows increased seepage after sustained rainfall. Recommend monitoring. Clay layer displacement detected. Intervention required. ... Double quotes. One of the leather journals contained personal entries from a geologist named Dr. Sarah Chun, dated 2003-2004. Clara's hands trembled as she read, "They won't listen. I've presented the data 5 times. The county says relocation isn't financially viable. They'd rather wait for disaster than prevent it. I'm leaving these documents here, in the old library basement. If anyone finds them, if anything happens, they'll know we tried. They'll know we warned them." The next entry, dated 3 months later, "I've created a protocol. If the pattern holds 3 days of heavy rain, followed by temperature drop, followed by rapid warming, the eastern ridge will fail within 48 hours. The seepage maps show exactly where. I've marked the safe zones in blue. Higher ground, ancient rock. If anyone reads this, go to the blue zones. Don't trust the valley floor." Clara flipped back to the maps with desperate speed. Blue zones. There, scattered across the higher elevations, areas marked stable bedrock. And one of them was only 3 miles from here, accessible by the old mining road. But the camp, the evacuation camp, where they'd sent everyone from her village and 3 others, sat directly in Red Zone 12. Her blood went cold. She checked the weather notes her grandmother had written just before she died. 3 days of rain, then cold, then the pattern was happening right now. The warmth today after yesterday's freeze. The early storm. They had 48 hours, maybe less. Clara's mind raced. She had to warn them, had to get back to the camp, show them the maps, make them move to higher ground. But even as she thought it, she knew the truth. They wouldn't listen. Just like they hadn't listened to Dr. Chun, just like they hadn't listened to her grandmother's warnings before the first slide. She started repacking frantically, shoving the manuscript and journals into her pack, along with her soaked supplies. She'd have to run through the storm, navigate 3 miles of unstable terrain in the dark, convince people who thought she was traumatized and unreliable that they needed to evacuate immediately, based on documents she'd found in an abandoned basement. That's when the fever hit. It came suddenly, a wave of dizziness that made the room tilt. Clara grabbed the edge of the desk, but her legs buckled. She fell hard, her bad shoulders slamming into the floor. Pain, white-hot and absolute. The flashlight rolled away, its beams spinning across the ceiling. She tried to stand, but her body wouldn't respond. The cold she'd ignored all day, the dampness in her clothes, the exhaustion she'd been running on, it all caught up at once. Her vision blurred. She could feel her pulse in her temples, too fast, too hot. The manuscript lay inches from her face, Dr. Chan's handwriting swimming in and out of focus. Safe zones. Blue zones. Higher ground. Clara's fingers brushed her grandmother's journal, where it had fallen from her jacket. She tried to open it, tried to focus, but the fever pulled at her like dark water. The last thing she heard before consciousness slipped was the storm outside, battering the broken library, and the deeper sound beneath it, the mountain, groaning in its sleep. Clara woke to pressure and warmth against her chest. For a confused moment, she thought she was home, in her bed, her grandmother's cat sleeping on her ribs like it always did. But the pressure was her own arm, clutched around her grandmother's journal, and the warmth was fever burning through her like wildfire. She didn't know how long she'd been unconscious. The room was darker. The storm outside was a constant roar. Her throat felt like broken glass when she tried to swallow. This is how it ends, she thought distantly. Not in the landslide with everyone else. Alone in a condemned building, too weak to save herself, let alone anyone else. The irony was almost funny. She'd survived the impossible, only to die of something as ordinary as exposure and fever. Her vision swam, but she forced herself to focus on the journal pressed against her chest. She could feel the shape of it, the familiar wear of the leather. Her grandmother had carried this for 40 years, through every season, every storm, every moment of doubt. It had survived floods and fires and time itself. The mountain remembers, the entry had said. Water doesn't forget. Clara's fevered brain turned the words over, trying to find meaning in them. The mountain remembers. Dr. Chone's maps showed the memory, every fault line, every weak point, every place where water had been carving away at stone for thousands of years. The landslides weren't random. They were the mountain remembering how to flow, and her grandmother she'd known. All those years of watching, measuring, recording. She'd been trying to learn the mountain's language, to predict its memory. Clara fumbled with the journal, her fingers clumsy with fever. She flipped to the last entries, the ones from her grandmother's final year. There, weather patterns for this exact season. Rainfall measurements. And at the bottom of the page, underlined 3 times, when the pattern comes, they won't believe you, they never do. But you don't warn them to be believed. You warn them to be right. When it happens, and they survive, they'll remember you told them. That's enough. The words hit harder than the fever. You don't warn them to be believed. You warn them to be right. Clara forced herself to sit up, every muscle screaming in protest. Her head pounded, her vision grayed at the edges. But she pulled her water bottle from the scattered supplies and drank, forcing liquid past her swollen throat. Then she found the first aid kit, swallowed 2 fever reducers dry because her hands were shaking too hard to open the water bottle again. She lay back down, pulling her sleeping bag over herself, clutching the journal and the manuscripts together. The fever would break or it wouldn't. She would survive the night or she wouldn't. But if she did, when she did, she had work to do. In her delirium, she dreamed of her grandmother standing at the ridgeline, notebook in hand, watching the clouds. In the dream, her grandmother turned and smiled and said, "The mountain's been trying to tell us. We just have to listen." When Clara woke again, the room was grey with dawn light. The fever had broken. She was soaked with sweat, weak as a newborn, but her mind was clear for the first time in weeks. A storm had passed, leaving only the steady drip of water through the damaged ceiling. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything hurt, but it was the manageable hurt of healing, not the sharp pain of breaking. She drank the rest of her water, ate half a protein bar, and spread the maps across the floor again. This time she studied them methodically, comparing Dr. Chone's geological surveys with her grandmother's weather records. The pattern was clear when she knew to look for it. Every major slide in the valley's recorded history had followed the same sequence: heavy rain, temperature drop, rapid warming. The water would seep into the clay layers, freeze and expand, then thaw suddenly. The clay would turn to slurry, and the slopes would fail. The evacuation camp sat directly in the path of Zone 12's projected slide zone. 300 people. Families from her village and 3 others. They'd be asleep right now, thinking they were safe because the government had put them there. Clara found a clean page in her grandmother's journal and began to write. She copied the most critical measurements, sketched the simplified maps showing red zones and blue zones, wrote out Dr. Chone's protocol in clear block letters. If they wouldn't believe her words, maybe they'd believe the data. And if they didn't believe the data, at least she'd have tried. She repacked methodically this time, organizing her supplies, waterproofing the documents in a plastic bag. Her shoulder still hurt, but she could move it through full range of motion now. Good enough. As she prepared to leave, she found one more item in the basement archives, a laminated evacuation route map showing the path to the nearest blue zone. Someone had marked it with reflective tape and preserved it carefully, as if they'd known someone would need it someday. Clara rolled it up and secured it to the outside of her pack. The library's front section was destroyed. The ceiling collapsed from yesterday, blocking the main entrance. But there was a window in the employee room large enough to climb through. As Clara squeezed through it into the cold morning air, she took one last look at the building that had almost killed her and saved her in the same night. "Thank you, Dr. Chun," she whispered. Then she started walking toward the camp, toward the 300 people who wouldn't want to hear what she had to say. But she was going to tell them anyway. Clara reached the evacuation camp by mid-morning, her legs burning from the rough terrain, but her mind focused. The camp coordinator, a tired-looking man named Mr. Reeves, who'd taught math at her old school, listened for exactly 90 seconds before shaking his head. "Clara, you've been through trauma. These documents are decades old. Our engineers have assured us this location is safe." She spread Dr. Chan's maps across his desk anyway, pointed to Zone 12, showed him her grandmother's weather records, explained the pattern. He looked at the papers with the kind of pitying expression that made her want to scream. "I'll make a note of your concerns," he said, which was administrative speak for "I'm humoring you." So Clara went around him. She started with the families she knew, the ones who'd lived in the valley long enough to remember her grandmother, Mrs. Pack, who'd lost her husband in a small slide 5 years ago. The Torres family, whose teenage son had been training as a weather watcher. Old Mr. Yamada, who still had the scars from the flood of '98. She showed them the maps, explained the pattern, pointed to the blue zone 3 miles north, higher ground, stable bedrock, accessible by the old mining road. She didn't try to convince them to believe her. She just gave them the information and let them decide. By noon, 40 people had packed their things and started walking north. By evening, it was 70. The camp coordinator threatened to call authorities, said she was causing panic, endangering people by leading them away from emergency services, but he couldn't stop them. The Valley families knew the weight of ignored warnings. They'd buried too many people who'd trusted official assurances. Clara led them up the mining road as the temperature dropped again, the second freeze Dr. Chone's protocol had predicted. She used the laminated evacuation map, checking landmarks against the route. Her shoulder ached. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she kept moving, kept counting heads, kept making sure the slowest walkers weren't falling behind. They reached the blue zone just as darkness fell, a plateau of ancient granite that had stood unchanged for millions of years. It wasn't comfortable. There were no facilities, no official shelter. But it was high, and it was stable. And when Clara checked the maps one last time by flashlight, she saw that it sat 200 feet above the highest projected slide zone. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of rain. Not the heavy downpour of the storm, but the steady, penetrating rain that Dr. Chone's notes had described as the final trigger. Rapid warming, rapid saturation, clay layers turning to liquid. She stood at the edge of the plateau, looking down at the valley. She could just barely see the evacuation camp in the distance, the white FEMA tents arranged in neat rows. 230 people still there, she calculated. 230 people who'd chosen to trust the authorities instead of the old warnings. "You did what you could," Mrs. Pack said quietly, standing beside her. "That's all anyone can do." 48 hours after they'd evacuated to the blue zone, it happened. Clara heard it first, the deep groan of earth moving, a sound she knew in her bones. Then she saw it, the eastern ridge sliding slowly at first, then faster, millions of tons of saturated earth breaking free. It didn't hit the camp directly. Zone 12's failure was more subtle, gradual slumping that would have crushed the tents slowly, giving people time to run, but not time to save anything. Through binoculars, borrowed from Mr. Yamada, Clara watched the evacuation. Emergency vehicles arriving, people running. The camp coordinator directing traffic, doing his job, despite having ignored the warning. They'd be fine, she realized. Shaken, displaced again, but alive. The mountain had spoken softly this time. A warning, not a catastrophe. Over the next week, more families trickled up to the blue zone. The survivors from the camp, once official evacuation sites had been established in towns farther away, came looking for the girl who'd been right. Engineers arrived, grudgingly confirming Dr. Chan's surveys. The old library, already damaged, finally collapsed completely during a aftershock, taking its secrets into the earth, except for the ones Clara had saved. She found herself becoming what her grandmother had been, a keeper of patterns, a reader of the mountain's language. She taught others to recognize the signs. She copied Dr. Chan's maps and distributed them to every valley community. She added her own observations to her grandmother's journal, continuing the record. 3 months later, when the state finally released Dr. Chone's full geological survey and issued formal apologies for decades of ignored warnings, Clara was invited to testify at the hearings. She brought her grandmother's journal and told them what her grandmother had known all along: the mountain remembers, and water doesn't forget, and the people who live here have to learn to listen. She still woke up sometimes with her hands shaking, still flinched at certain sounds. The landslide that took her village hadn't disappeared from her mind, it had just become part of the pattern she carried now. Another data point in the mountain's memory. The pain hadn't made her weaker. It had made her someone who understood what was at stake when warnings went unheeded. On the anniversary of the day she'd broken into the abandoned library, Clara hiked back to where it had stood. The building was gone, but the foundation remained, already being overtaken by new growth. She placed a small marker there, carved with 2 names, Dr. Sarah Chun and her grandmother, keepers of knowledge who'd tried to save people who wouldn't listen. "I listened," Clara said, to the ruins and the mountain and the memory of everyone who'd tried, "and I won't let them forget." Then she walked back up to the blue zone, where 70 families had started building something new, a community that listened to the earth instead of ignoring it, that honored old warnings instead of dismissing them. The mountain would remember, And now, so would they.